So yeah, guys, thanks for coming out digitally, virtually. My name's Travis. I am one of the co-organizers of Nashville Cocoa Heads. And, you know, for those of you who, I think we've got a lot of the faithful tonight, but if somebody's not familiar, you know, this is a meetup solely dedicated to all things Apple development, you know, so originally the Cocoa environment, but we always want to talk about anything that, that Apple is doing in terms of software development. We've talked about anything, do a lot of Swift, obviously, some Objective-C, done talks on MapKit, we've done talks on any sort of framework. So yeah, I'm trying to think any other housekeeping. I think some of you might have heard we're doing virtually, obviously, this month. Hopefully next month we will be back in person. We're currently being hosted by our friends over at iHeartRadio or iHeartMedia, and they are downtown off of Broadway. And hopefully next month we can all be in person, see each other's smiling faces, and talk more development in person. But until then, and we're doing this. The other thing I'd like to point out is the way we like to connect with everybody and get things out besides Meetup currently is we have a Slack channel. I'll put a slide up at the end of this talk that has the Slack on it. So if you're not on there, we'd love to get on that. And we also have Twitter that we try to post announcements on as well. So yeah, without further ado, we'll talk a little bit about tonight's topic, which is tvOS within the context of TVML, TVJS. So let's share my screen here. And all right. So the idea of this talk is to be just kind of getting going on the concept of creating a tvOS app with TVMLKit. So we're going to talk about three things. We're going to do a quick overview of what makes up TVML and TVMLJS, and then we're going to talk a little bit about why we might use this client-server approach that's a bit of a different paradigm than doing a native app. And then we'll talk about ways that we present the data in these, what I've kind of heard deemed catalog apps. You know, these are apps that have data that we're pulling from somewhere, and we're just presenting thumbnails, images, trailers, previews of that data, and then we're hitting play, or we are pushing a button to get a full screen view of it, or something that we're just seeing a list of items, and then we're wanting to consume that from that list. Okay, so first off, TVML and TVMLJS. So what are they and how do they go together? So there are native apps like UIKit and SwiftUI apps, and there are these TVML TVMLJS apps that so there's sort of two different ecosystems you can work with in tvOS. TVML is Apple's custom XML, so it stands for Television Markup Language. It's really just a set of extensions or a set of elements that they've extended on and put on top of XML. TVMLJS is Apple's JavaScript APIs, which help you display that content. And then the TVMLKit is sort of the glue between the above mentioned APIs. Mostly, unless you're getting really deep and trying to create what they call a hybrid app, which I wouldn't really recommend doing, you're going to really only need to know about TVML and TVMLJS. When I say a hybrid app in the context of TVMLKit, I'm talking about there is the possibility of using UIKit, Swift, and all of that to then also use TVML and TVMLJS. And to me, it just seems like an uphill battle, but there might be use cases and reasons for all that. So I guess I'll just briefly mention that it is possible to build one of these hybrid apps. So I mentioned JavaScript. I did say JavaScript, so we won't be talking about Swift really tonight or Objective-C. It'll be purely based around JavaScript. Yep. So a TVML app is a very specific implementation of a web view, is what I'll call it, because Apple doesn't really like calling it just like a web browser. Like, they don't want you to say, I think there have been people that have characterized these apps as like, well, it's just a browser. And I would put it probably more akin to like, it's more like maybe like an Electron app, where they have stripped down and focused a browser container into a for use bespoke application. So that might be a crude way of thinking about it, but it's using, I think at its core, it's using browser type stuff. And you'll see some of that when I get into a demo. And then you can use plain XML right along TVML. So there's not like you can only use TVML. And then on the TVMLJS side, you're using ES6 JavaScript in your JavaScript file. I discovered that not all ES6 things that I thought would be in there are in there. So, that's one thing to note. So just like on the web, where we use HTML to give structure to content and CSS to style that structure, and then JavaScript to manipulate it, we're doing all the same activities with TVML and TVMLJS. So TVML is giving structure to our content, and then we actually are using a little bit of CSS when necessary to style that content, and then we're manipulating it and with JavaScript and TVMLJS to manipulate and deliver that content. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this client-server model. The good, the bad, and the ugly of it all. So obviously, if you're a developer and you've worked in this, if you've worked in development for a little while, client-server is very basic conceptual approach. But for the uninitiated, real fast, there's the idea that you have a server or basically a computer in a data center in a cloud somewhere that has, excuse me guys, we have somebody we need to admit into the talk. Welcome, Michael. So yeah, to the uninitiated, you have a server, it's up in the cloud somewhere. It has data on it, and then we need to respond. We want to grab that data from a client. So in our case, tonight it's the Apple TV device. That would be our client. So I would first say, if you're an iOS developer, if you're a native mobile app developer, if you develop apps for iPad, this is a big paradigm shift. And I would say for two big reasons. One, the Apple TV and tvOS, the main use is just consumption. So with iOS, with Apple, with iPad, with macOS, we are generally consuming stuff, but then we are also creating, or we're interacting, we're playing. tvOS, Apple TV is really about just finding a bit of data and consuming it oftentimes. I know that there are cases where we can play games on tvOS, and that's a slightly different thing. But for these client server apps, these catalog apps, consumption is the name of the game. The other thing I would remind you of is that with Apple TV, since it's a set-top box that's intended to be in your living room, connected to a television, it's always connected. So, and to kind of even further push that point home, if you flip around the back of an Apple TV, you will see that it has a network interface connection where you can hardwire, you can put a network cable directly into it. So it's meant to sit there and always be connected. So it can quickly stream, it can grab data whenever it needs to. The reliability of the connection should always be there. It should always be robust. So, since we can store our XML on a server and fetch JSON from somewhere else, most of our app can be updated or changed without having to go through App Store review. So really, what's living on the Apple TV when we download an app with this paradigm is going to be a very tiny Swift file, and then a very small application.js file or JavaScript file that is really just kind of manipulating the app. Everything else we can store off device. So we can grab our XML from a server. We can also grab JSON from that same server or from another API, whatever we need to do. Another reminder about tvOS is that device storage is limited. You get 4 gigs per bundle and 500 kilobytes of persisted storage. So, conceptually, Apple is really sort of laying it down saying, no, we don't want you to be storing, you're not going to be storing movies on here. You're not going to be storing photos or music. This device is for consuming and streaming that content into the home, into the living room. So since this approach relies on JavaScript and XML, if you're not knowledgeable with Swift or Xcode, then this actually works to somewhat your advantage. You really don't need a whole lot of knowledge in Swift or Xcode. You really just need to be able to code JavaScript and all the trappings that has. The other thing I would mention about this approach, it's like I said, it's catalog apps, and you've already seen these if you have a tvOS app. If you've ever, a tvOS, if you've ever used the Apple Music app, the original Apple Movies app, all of these are based on TVML. So a lot of the first class Apple apps are just TVML apps. So Apple has built tons of templates for layouts. So once you get going, it's really fast to develop. You just kind of grab one of their templates. In their documentation, they have layouts that they suggest, and they tell you about all the different TVML specific layouts. And then there's a demo app that I would highly recommend getting if you're wanting to dive into this, where you can, they just literally have the code there and have a working example, and you can use that working example, copy and paste to your heart's content, and have something that looks just like Apple's first-party apps. Okay, so let's talk about ways to present data. So the different approaches to manipulating data. This is kind of what I really wanted to dive into and understand more with Apple TV and tvOS and TVMLKit. So there's 3 ways to do data in this paradigm. There's just doing plain old string interpolation. There's third-party templating languages, or there's the data binding API from Apple. So string interpolation, it's probably the simplest and most straight ahead. And this is what I mean by that is, if you can see this example I've got over on the slide to the side, we just have a JavaScript function, and within that we've defined a constant called markup, and then we have XML as a text file. And then if you look about 3/4 of the way down on line 11, we have a string interpolation of the $ with the curly brace open and the shelf titles.map. That's string interpolation in JavaScript. And so all we're doing is just slapping whatever data we need straight into that string. This is how Apple first recommended doing TVML development. If you go back to, I believe it was 2016, when they first introduced Apple TV, tvOS, well, the Apple TV that we know today. This is how all of their apps were initially built, all the code that you see from them. It's just creating JavaScript functions with a bit of text and interpolating data as they needed. I would say some of the downsides of that is just it gets really stringy really fast, right? You have we're not really actually looking at XML right now. We're looking at a string that will eventually become XML once it gets injected into the right place. And it's not really a client server approach if you've got all of this sitting in your application.js file, which is one of the only files that comes and sits on the device. So you're really just kind of, while this might be the hackiest and the fastest way to get going, it also is, it kind of breaks the idea of that, the advantage, to me, one of the big advantages of that client server approach, which is I can update that file and then push it into the device without ever having to go through App Store review. So a templating language would be kind of the hybrid approach. And this is where you would just pull in XML from your server, and then you would inject the JavaScript anywhere you want. You have to use a third-party library like mustache.js or handlebars. I think this is a really flexible approach that it preserves that client server architecture, but it'll be familiar with you if you've ever done like templating. I consider Apple developer or people who develop in the Apple ecosystem slightly more resistant to third-party libraries than let's say in the JavaScript world. So some might say that's a negative. If you're more on the JavaScript, come from the JavaScript world, you probably don't care, and you're just like, yeah, let's just light up a third-party dependency and go to town. There's when you get to a really large data set, this is potentially not as performant as the data bindings API. There's a talk from Apple from several years ago that shows that when they introduced their data bindings API, that load times went down dramatically. There's a guy who blogged about tvOS a lot, and he did some tests, and he found though that on smaller data sets, when we're talking a couple hundred items, less than 100 items, maybe even up to 500 or 1,000 items, performance change was negligible between using like just string interpolation or even using their data bindings API. So while I say it's not as performant, I'm talking when we're talking, if we're needing to consume like a few thousand items. So maybe something like, let's say you wanted to recreate a Photos app. The data bindings API might be the way to go, even though it we'll find out some of the pitfalls here right now. So data bindings API is sort of the Apple way of doing things. It's essentially a first-class templating language. Like I said, for large data sets, it's the most performant. Probably the biggest downside is it's only available at the section level of your XML. Well, I'll talk about that in just a second. And the other big downside is its classic Apple documentation. So there is documentation on it. I consider the documentation sometimes useful and sometimes spurious and terse. And then the other way I would find out about things would be watching WWDC videos, and there are parts of the API that aren't documented on the web. They're just literally documented in those videos. So, but if you've worked in the Apple ecosystem, I don't want to say you're used to it, but you've probably run across that before. So what I meant by only available at the section level of your XML is if we're looking at this example here over off to the right, we have on line 1, we have a piece of XML that we're identifying as prototypes. And then line 7, we start an XML tag, and then we call banner. And then on line 10, we start a collection list. We don't see the end of that. But there on line 15, the very second to last line, we have we have a section, and we've put a binding attribute, and then we put a string in that says items : curly brace movies. And so what that's doing is essentially that's saying there's a collection titled movies, and inside the section we are going to use that collection of movies. And then what we're doing with that collection is up there actually where it says prototypes. So on line 1 through 6, I know this is a little bit confusing, but we're sort of establishing what we call a prototype. So line 2, we've got a lockup, and a lockup is just another TVML term where what we're doing is we're just grouping all of that XML together. So lines 3 and 4 are being treated as one element because they're inside that lockup. But you'll notice we're saying that we're identifying it's a prototype, and then you'll even see that we have an onSelect attribute where we're calling a function. And then on line 3, we've got another binding where we're calling an attribute, which is going to be an image URL. And then we're just doing plain old XML type stuff where we put a width, a height. And then we've got on line 4, we've got a title where we've got where we're putting in a text content. This is another one of the other binding attributes. There's only a few of them. There's only text content, there's only attribute, and then there's only items. And I think there's a couple more, but those are the only ones that are documented on the site. There's also children and 1 or 2 more. So anyway, line 4 there, we're bringing in that text content title, and that's just going to, like it says, display text. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about getting going, and then we'll look at some code and just sort of talk about. I think it'll make more sense. All my talks are this way. If you've never been to one of my talks, they don't make sense until I show code. So you got to get a local web server running if you're just running a TVML app, and Apple gives really good instructions on that, and I'll show you here in a second. And then you'll want to make sure that you have app transport security settings in the info.plist to allow loads and set its value to yes. So for those of you who don't understand what that means, basically Apple requires that all incoming HTTP be secure, so HTTPS requests, but that's kind of a pain to get going. So the easiest way around that is to just disable that requirement. And obviously when you ship or release an app, you should change that back and use a secure HTTP request for traffic. And then I felt like 1 or 2 times when I was loading a template app, or from Xcode, that TV base URL and TV boot URL variables in the appdelegate.swift file were either not right or needed to be augmented. All right, so let's just look at a working demo. Okay, so first off, I'll just point out that I have I've got a terminal running here with a little Ruby server. And then the other thing I will point out is since we're talking JavaScript, I would highly recommend not using Xcode. Xcode is not that great of an IDE when it comes to JavaScript. So I'm here in VS Code with my application.js file open and my 2 XML files open. So once you get everything set up and going, we can go over to Xcode, and we have this appdelegate.swift. This is really just kind of acting as a container. And basically what it does is it kicks off our app and then tells JavaScript that, hey, you do all the work now. So we hit run. And you will experience what it was like to develop on your 2015 MacBook Pro, because I'm still on one, and how slow it is to run an app. So this app, it's just calling from the iTunes Movie API. And when it gets loaded here, hopefully we will see it's going to do a quick loading page. Then it should have a shelf, and then we'll see a detail screen. So another thing that I would point out while we're here is all I've done is define XML for what this should look like, and I'll show you that in a second. But in terms of user experience, the way that this is automatically, this is all free. The way this is that's carouseling right there. The sound, I don't know if you guys can hear the sound, but we all get all that for free. The way it gets bigger, each cell, that's all just there. That's just part of so really you get to focus on just getting the data in there and getting your structure right. So we've got this detail, and as you can see, we've got a title, and we've got a genre and a director and a release date, and then if we want, we can hit play and it'll play this trailer. This is all going a little bit slower because of the bandwidth that we're taking up here on this Zoom call. So maybe just watch this trailer get going, just so you believe me, and then we'll stop. And then once again, interactions. All of our interactions with the remote are kind of built in for free. So getting back, I just hit menu. Getting back out, I just hit menu. Okay, so let's take a look at some code. Like I said, now we're running here. We've hit play. We're going to go over to our. We could do all of this over in our over in Xcode here, but it's we just don't get a lot of syntax highlighting. We don't get a lot of IntelliSense or anything like that. So to me, a more native JavaScript editor is the way to go. And as you can see, what I've done here is I'll just do a really quick walkthrough. I'm going to probably blow over some stuff that people are going to want to know about, but one of the TVMLKit JS things is we get app, and then we do an on launch. This is where basically our app gets kicked off. We're grabbing from that iTunes API, and then we're gonna get our XML template, and we have our callback function that is gonna get the JSON, and then it's also going to insert that JSON into the template. When it does that, we've got this insert JSON function that's just doing some fun things, creating what we call data items. These are this is part of the TVMLKit JS API. We're creating data items to bind for that bindings API. And then we're just identifying where these sections are. Like I said earlier, you have to bind within the sections of the TVML or XML. And this is that get document function that we was talking about earlier. Where we actually called this from within the XML on a select of an element. So this actually calls that detail page. And yeah, so we push that page onto the stack. We put all the details in. So, the title, the genre, the director, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We create more data items. We've got a little function to play the movies, stuff like that. So let's take a look at the XML. I think that's also somewhat worth talking about. Oh, real quick too, even though I said, doing the string with string interpolation isn't necessarily the way to go. For these small loading templates, like you saw when you saw the spinning wheel rotate, or the rotating circle, and you saw the words loading while the detail page was loading. We see that a common pattern of just using those for these small strings for that, but otherwise trying to put the XML, on the server. So this is that shelf or that home page that we saw. And as you can see, we've got a document, and then they're just putting their style right here. So this is kind of faux CSS, just right in there. And then, like I said, we've got prototypes, which are essentially each of these represent one of these little cards. So you see, we've got the image, we've got the title, and you see right here, we've got the on select, we've got the image URL, we've got the title. You'll see we've got a prototype for comedy. Essentially, when you create a data item, you have to give it a group name, and I've chose to put comedy. So right now that that shelf is being filtered essentially on. Let me find it here, guys. So the data item has to have two properties, an ID, and let's just call it a category. And right now I'm filtering on this. It can really be any term you want, but it has to be a term that it would group the JSON. So if you imagine the JSON for each of these movies at some point, has a genre, comedy, and so it's filtering them all out and putting them all like that. But then down here on line 25, where we've got this section, like I said, we can only bind items to within the section. So what we're saying is, hey, that thing called movies, let's use this lockup prototype to iterate and insert all of them. So going back to this insert JSON function, just to show you, we're setting a property path, and we're calling it movies, and we're using the new items array. So then, like I said, we've got on select here. So when I select this, whatever this lockup is, it's going to call the get document function, and then it's going to insert this path in, and then we want to send the event to that function. But ultimately what it does is it calls the movie detail page, and then it populates the movie detail page. So this one I'm using a TVML thing called a product template, and calling the prototype the detail. It's the dark theme. And we've got, once again, we're just using a lot of text bindings. So this probably looks very similar to, like, if you've ever done HTML and then just interpreted JavaScript into it, or even JSX if you've done React. Once again, we're just creating a little lockup here and treating this button all as one. One thing you'll notice is that we've got a thing called badge, and then we're using source, resource, button, play. So TVML has all sorts of free little buttons and icons, like a play button, a load button, Rotten Tomatoes logo, all that sort of stuff to just get going. I've got this in here. I don't think I'm actually using it, but this is what they call a fragment. This is basically an invisible element that you can just hide in the DOM so that you can access content if you need it there. You'll see that we're instantiating a class here on this shelf called 9-column grid. That was just something that was for free in the template. And then once again, yeah, we've just got another prototype with another lockup that is showing that bottom shelf and that detail page. So let's see here. that's probably that's the long and short of it. Let me see. So, well, once again, my talks, I tend to like to blast through my deck, and then we'll do more of a longer Q&A. My final thoughts on this is that for a little bit of effort, one could build a really great looking app with a great user experience. I think another advantage is even for a little effort as a JavaScript developer, like there is no hill to climb of, well, I got to learn Swift if I want to build a tvOS app. I think at the end of the day that the Apple, the binding data API might not be worth the effort. As you can see, it was somewhat limited in what it can do. And the documentation I didn't feel like was that great. Whereas I felt like if maybe you could kind of go the middle ground of just using like mustache.js or handlebars, you've got great documentation on how those templating languages work, and you can kind of just slap them anywhere. Yeah, so like I said, I think for the uninitiated, you can get really great results really quickly if you just lean into the happy path of Apple's catalog templates and just doing kind of do that client server approach, which is the way they recommend. So, oh man, I forgot to swap out my my template. Sorry, folks, you shouldn't be seeing a jellyfish. So yeah, any questions? What do y'all got? What questions do you have? I know I kind of just blew through that, but what are your thoughts?
I guess we could talk about history and why Apple decided to go with JavaScript for this.
From near as I could tell, so you have to remember SwiftUI didn't exist, or it existed, but it was probably secretly being built over by the watchOS team. I think the other big reason is that it's very obvious that just using a web view is a very easy way to go. As far as now, why they didn't just let you sort of use plain HTML, that's beyond me. And there's, some of the hiccups that I ran into, for example, in when you talk about using JavaScript, like I wanted to not use the XML HTTP request class that they have, and it took me a while to finally realize that that's just the fetch request is not in there, and that I could probably figure out a way to import that or Axios or whatever, but I had trouble even just getting the import stuff working. That also brings up another question that probably people are having is like, well, can I use this? Can I use React? Can I use Tailwind CSS? Can I use this or can I use that? The answer is probably, and the answer is definitely yes on some of that stuff. There's actually a couple of third-party libraries of people implementing. For example, there's a guy that I think implemented an all JavaScript version of the TVML language, so you could just do it all somehow in JavaScript. There's also somebody who wrote a React library for this. So you could just do a React app and have it do all that. I think that's going a little bit too far, in my opinion, because it's really the point is, to me, about doing this is doing this sort of catalog thing that Apple does. So, if you look at those first party apps that they built and say, man, I just want to kind of copy that, then that's sort of what I think this is for. Another thing that comes to mind too is if you're feeling like your app needs to be the fastest and the speediest and the most performant, then a UIKit or SwiftUI app will be the way to go.
Do you know how many of these tvOS apps exist in the store?
Oh, that's a great question. I would guess that there are way more than you would expect. And the reason is, as I was doing some research, I found out that there is a company that that sells as a service a third-party app service where basically you just hand them a way to serve your videos. So essentially, you give them your video API, and then and they can even use Vimeo. So if you're uploading to Vimeo, then what they can do is they can build you a custom app as a service, and you can if you can connect the dots of what I just did and what I just demoed, you can see all they're doing is selling one app over and over again, and then probably creating an authentication layer, and you're actually logging into your version of the app. So I would guess that there are thousands. And then as far as some of the bigger name apps, I really doubt that the Netflixes of the world and the Disney Pluses of the world are still using this model. But I totally think for the like I said, for the person that just needs to get a basic app going rather quickly, that there's probably a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to your point, Jim, like I did a lot of research. I did a lot of actually, just literally searching the keywords TVML, TVJS on GitHub, and public apps out there in the world. There weren't that many. So I would say I would agree that in the grand scheme of things, there's probably not as many of these apps as you would think, but probably more than you would expect if you're an iOS developer, and maybe less than you would expect if you're a JavaScript developer.
So do you think there are a lot of just private apps out there?
I think so. I haven't downloaded a lot. Once you start seeing, if you were to download this catalog app and sort of look at the examples, then you start to see all of the UI elements that are most likely used. And once you see that, you go, oh yeah, that's probably a TVML app. And so and then if you look at one of their Apple talks, they sort of tell you, hey, these are the apps that we have built. And this was obviously a lot of this stuff is kind of old, in 2017, 2018 talks that they talk about. These are the apps that we've built in TVML. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
Interesting, thanks.
I think one other thing I also forgot to talk about is, I will say probably the biggest downside, this is maybe me burying the lead or something, is debugging really sucks with this paradigm. Because if you notice, I'm having to trigger the whole app from this container. So it's being run right here from Xcode, but I can't really use, it's kind of hard to use this as a debugger when you really wanted to view in Xcode. You can get some console logging and stuff, and the way that's done is some of the logs actually do come up in the log down here, but you can also fire off a what do they call it here in the develop menu. We can get a web inspector going for this app, but it only starts up after you start the app. So my usual web debugging thing would be to put like a debugger statement or a breakpoint, in here, and then run the app. But you can't really do that because the way you run the app is from Xcode. So it felt that was a little bit painful, but it's one of those things I just kind of got used to, and I realized if I were a better developer, if I were not as green as I am, that I would probably not have wouldn't have as much need to debug as I did. So. Any other questions?
I guess are you going to have this code on a GitHub server?
Yes, I'll post this to GitHub. I also usually like to post a lot of other resources that I've found. There are a few good tutorials out there that are still relevant. There's a Ray Wanderlich one, and then there's, to be honest, Apple does have a few demo apps that they've got on their site that I think are more valuable than others. Like I said, there's a catalog app, and then there's one called data binding with TVML that I used extensively. So yeah, I will post some links in. Are you part of our Slack channel, Jim?
Not yet.
I will. I'll try to shoot you an invite to that, and make sure you get. And I will also try to put the links in a message out on meetup.com. And yeah, like I said, I'll try to collect some links and get you some further info so you can dive in some more.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, guys, that's kind of a short and sweet one. But thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. And with that, I guess we'll conclude.
Thanks a lot, Travis.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
It's good to see everybody's names, at least, if not faces.
Yeah.